We are now back on the record. I would like to first thank Representative Ortiz and Carolyn Ham for your patience this morning. Thank you for sitting through half of our meeting. It was an hour. Yeah, if you could now begin your introduction for House Bill 30.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. For the record, I am Representative Dan Ortiz. I represent District 1, which is Southern Southeast Alaska.
And I'm Caroline Hamp, staff to Representative Ortiz.
Again, thank you, Chair McCormick and members of the committee for hearing House Bill 30 today. If enacted, House Bill 30 establishes daylight savings time year-round. Daylight savings time is observed between the second Sunday of March, which we all just recently experienced, and the first Sunday of November, or the time we are currently in. For example, how this bill would work: we would spring forward one last time, just like we did last Sunday, and then never fall back. If we were to transition fully to daylight savings time, and the East Coast did not, we would only be 3 hours behind during winter months and would have the regular 4-hour time difference during summer months. I'd also like to note that this legislature, almost a decade ago, heard a bill to keep us on standard time, not daylight savings time. This bill would also was also a time change bill, but that's where the similarities end. This bill would keep us on daylight savings time as opposed to standard time. There are many benefits, folks, to staying in daylight savings time. Your packet, apologize for its depth of, lots of stuff there. They include 4 studies showing some of the benefits, which include increased physical activity, decrease in robberies, increase in economic spending, and a decrease in fatal car crashes. And the list goes on, but I won't keep going. There's also a study in your packet showing public support to stop changing clocks and overall preference for daylight savings time over standard time. Moving to full daylight savings time requires action by the United States Congress. Congress will need to amend federal law to allow states to observe daylight savings time all year. Or Congress could enact the Sunshine Protection Act, which would keep the entire United States on daylight savings time and would supersede HB30. You might recall, some of you might have been aware that in the last federal legislative session, the Senate passed a daylight savings time bill, but then the House didn't take action, and now this is a new legislature, so I'm not sure what the direction is. I haven't heard too much about the issue here recently. Nationally, there is an initiative to change to full-time daylight savings time. So far, 19 states have enacted daylight savings time legislation, and additional 21 states are considering legislation this year. On the West Coast, California voters authorized the change pending legislation, and both Oregon and Washington passed legislation in 2019, similar to the bill before you. Year-round daylight savings time is also gaining traction in Canada. Yukon began full-time daylight savings time on March 8th, 2020. British Columbia passed legislation to implement year-round daylight savings time that is contingent on the United States West Coast also implementing it, like my bill. Because of our close economic and geographic ties to the U.S. and Canadian West Coast, Alaska can avoid, we can all avoid it, folks, being left in the dark by passing HB30. So it's up to our folks. We can, if the rest of the western states would move in direction and we got authorization from the U.S. Congress, and if we didn't pass this particular bill, then we would be, we'd be off from what our current situation is. And I'd just like to take a note, my bill does keep us on daylight savings time, which I realize creates probably some concern, particularly for the far western part of the state, being that they already, have a late sunrise, and this would even be a later sunrise if we didn't turn our clocks. Yeah, if we didn't move our clocks forward or turn them back in the fall. So in any case, there is that one issue, which I can see some of the part of the state having. But other than that, I've pretty much received support from places like Anchorage and Southeast Alaska, you know, in that part of the state, I've received a lot of support. And generally, I'm sure you've all received some recent emails just because everybody kind of is aggravated by the fact that we had to, you know, move our clocks forward and lost an hour of sleep. So it's kind of on people's mind right now. But anyway, thanks for the opportunity for presenting, and I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Thank you, Rep. Ortiz. Vice Chair McCabe, do you have a question?
Thanks. I have two questions, actually. One of the reasons that the Sunshine Protection Act in the lower 48 is worrisome to parents is the buses for children. And I suspect in Alaska you haven't heard much of that because probably most of the school year our children are on buses in the dark anyways.
Right.
I don't know, have you got any pushback from that? And I'm also curious about these things that automatically change for daylight savings time. Is there reprogramming? Can we shut that off? Do you know anything about that?
Through the chair, Representative McCabe, good question. I had that very thought for the first time this morning, as a matter of fact. I thought, what would happen with my clock if we made this change? How, with my phone, we made this change? I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to research that. I will research that and see what would happen with that. It's a good thought. Like I said, I had that thought for the first time. For some reason, I hadn't thought about that. And then I realized, hey, wait a minute. If we were to make this change, what would happen with these phones? But it's a good question.
If I could take a shot in the dark on that one, I would think that, no pun intended, but thank you for laughing.
Okay.
I would assume it would be connected. I think that's reset by internet connection or something like that, and so it might automatically do it that way. Just a thought.
Well, we will look into that particular question. Maybe it is an automatic situation, and I didn't fully answer your question. You asked whether or not we received any pushback from any parts of the state in relationship to the change in the amount of daylight, particularly when students are riding buses to school. And I would say that I haven't received any specific pushback on that. I think you're correct, Representative McCabe. Like in my community, we already go to school in the dark, or we come home in the dark. So, and in many, of course, a lot of the state is year round. Not year round, but in the wintertime, they go to school in the dark and they come home in the dark. I don't think there'd be that much of an impact in relationship to, well, there would be an impact. Like I said, in the western part of the state, the sun would rise that much later, and they would have that much more sunshine at the end of the day, which they already have plenty at the end of the day, it sounds like. But I think when I've thought about this bill, I can see that the biggest impact, perhaps negative, might be in the western part of the state. But again, my bill is not necessarily about a strong preference over standard time versus daylight savings time. It's more about, in the event that the West Coast changes, we don't want to be off with the West Coast. That's just bad in a lot of ways. Creates confusion, creates lots of uncertainty and those kinds of things. And it's more about staying in line with the West Coast than it is about any particular preference over standard time versus daylight savings time. Although in my community, daylight savings time would work better. It would work better. So,
Follow up, Vice Chair
Follow-up.
McCabe?
So I think Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Buchanan have introduced Rubio. Of course, it's the Sunshine Act, as you mentioned. Do you have like a companion resolution from the Alaska legislature encouraging Congress to pass this? Something you considered maybe if we should move this bill out?
through the chair, Representative McCabe, good idea. You've come up with two this morning. You've come up with a good question and a good idea.
I can go home.
An extra hour of sleep.
That's a good thought. We'll look into that particular possibility, and through the chair, Representative McCabe, maybe you could be the sponsor of that resolution, and I'll be happy to sign on to it. But we'll work together on that one. Anyway, good thought.
Representative Mears.
Thank you, through the chair. I hadn't realized really how much that all our time changes have changed so much in my lifetime. And this is something that has very much been in flux. I remember when we moved back the fall time, and all of a sudden my children were trick-or-treating when it was much later outside, and how, how I appreciated that. And now that my children are big, I will not quite realize the advantages, although the Anchorage School District does a pretty good job of timing spring break so that that time change happens, where the children have got a week to adjust. But I do, reading through the support letters or the testimony that there have previously been, I do think that there is some real consideration for Western Alaska. As we were discussing, earlier, Alaska is a very big state, and where we are now on the very eastern side of the state, and where things are in Western Alaska, there's, how many time zones did we used to have? It's a significant difference, and I really think that I support the idea of keeping the time the same, but really do think that we need to be thinking about standard time and consideration for Western Alaska. Thank you.
Representative Ruffridge.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair, has there been any consideration for, to Representative Mears's point, the Alaska has quite a span of returning back to some sort of split for Western Alaska if we were to stay on essentially one time, or is that Alaska likes just being all on the same time? What are the thoughts on that?
Through the chair, this is Caroline Hamp, staff to Representative Ortiz. Representative Ruffridge, we could state a preference, but ultimately it's up to federal decision. We obtained a legal memo in 2021 that I'm happy to share with the members about changing Alaska to multiple time zones again, and once again, it's up to federal decision.
Thank you.
Rep. Himshoot, did I see you raise your hand? Okay, Vice Chair McCabe.
So I have one more question. In the 1970s, and I wasn't in Alaska then, the whole United States did this for 10 months because of the energy that was the initial oil crisis under Carter, I think, where oil went from 32 cents a gallon, or gas went from 32 cents a gallon. So remember when we dropped the speed limit to 55 countrywide? This was another part of it. I'm a little unclear if Alaska followed that, because at the time I think we had 5 time zones. So did we follow that with all 5 time zones? Did we follow it at all? Do you know?
Through the chair, Representative McCabe, yes, I believe that Alaska did follow it at the time. And I do want to make a comment about that change because daylight savings time wasn't always preferred at that time. I think there was a little bit of pushback, and we found that the pushback in the 70s came from the fact that many children at the time rode their bikes or walked to school, and it was a safety issue. And now, especially in the mornings, as we've discussed prior, with it being darker in the mornings, so we saw that a study that almost 50% of students walked or rode their bikes to school in 1969, whereas a similar study in 2009 showed that only 13% of students walked or rode their bikes to school nationally. That obviously might look different in Alaska. I know our transportation is a bit different, but that does show kind of why there was a little bit of a pushback when we did do that 10-month change.
Thanks.
Follow up? No?
Nope, I'm good.
So one question I did have, and if you can't answer that, that's fine. But could you speak to the original purpose of daylight savings and kind of dispel any of the misconceptions that it was to benefit farmers, please?
Through the chair, to the chair, this is Caroline Hamp. Originally, daylight savings was a measure to help with light and just being able to do your day-to-day tasks and have as much light as possible while you were doing that without burning your candles down or using electricity when you didn't have means to. It never was supported. The time change was never supported by farmers. I don't know where that rumor started, but most farmers are adamantly against time change. I grew up in the Midwest, actually. I did not grow up in Alaska. And for a long time, Indiana did not do time change because the farmers were so adamantly against it.
Follow-up question I might have to that then. Is it true that energy consumption actually increases during daylight savings changes?
To the chair, this is Caroline again. I have a study that shows, and I can share this with the committee. There's a study that shows there's very, very little difference in either daylight or standard or whatever time you're in. There's very little difference in energy costs and energy consumption, just because in our modern day and age, we're just kind of always using energy, regardless of the light out.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from committee members? No. Okay. Well, and I've heard that you have no invited testimony. Okay. All right. In that case, thank you very much for presenting today. We will set this bill aside and probably have public testimony at a later date. So that's all we